The morning started like every other morning for Emily, the young waitress who worked at the small but always busy cafe on the corner of the street. The smell of fresh coffee beans floated through the air, mixing with the sweet scent of warm pastries that had just come out of the oven. Customers chatted quietly at their tables, and the sound of spoons clinking against ceramic cups filled the cozy place with a familiar rhythm. Emily tied her apron a little tighter around her waist and pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She had been working here for 2 years now, and although the routine was the same, she still carried a smile on her face, because she knew that kindness cost nothing, and it often made her long, tiring shifts feel a little lighter. Emily had grown used to serving all kinds of people, from tired office workers rushing for their morning coffee to young couples who came to share a slice of cake. Sometimes she even saw old men who stayed for hours just reading the newspaper. She treated them all the same, with patience and warmth. She had learned long ago that even a simple good morning could brighten someone's entire day. Behind that smile, though, her life was not as easy as she made it seem. She lived with her mother, Margaret, in a small rented apartment, and every paycheck she earned was stretched thin to cover bills, groceries, and her mother's medicines. Her father was never in the picture, and though her mother had always told her not to worry about it, the absence left a quiet ache in her heart. But Emily never complained. She had accepted her life for what it was, and she worked hard to make the best of it. On this particular day, Emily woke up feeling more tired than usual. She had stayed up late helping her mother with sewing work they sometimes did together for extra income. Still, she refused to let her exhaustion show. She walked into the cafe with a bright smile and greeted her coworkers. The manager, Mrs. Allen, reminded her to keep up her energy because a rush was expected, and sure enough, within half an hour, the cafe was filled with customers. The line stretched to the door, and the little bell above it kept jingling as more people walked in. Emily moved quickly between tables, balancing trays of coffee cups and plates of croissants. Sometimes she stumbled a little, but she always laughed it off. The regular customers knew her well, and they often commented on how cheerful she was even on the busiest days. Yet beneath that cheerful mask, Emily sometimes felt a wave of tiredness and hopelessness. She wondered what her life would look like in 5 years. Would she still be running around this cafe, or would she finally get a chance to go back to school? Her dream had always been to study business, to one day open her own little bakery. But dreams cost money, and money was the one thing she never had enough of. Whenever such thoughts crept into her mind, she would remind herself that her mother depended on her, and that was enough reason to keep moving forward. She always found strength in the love she had for her mother, and that love was the fuel that kept her on her feet. The cafe itself was nothing glamorous. The walls were painted in warm cream tones. The wooden tables were a little scratched from years of use, and the chairs wobbled if you sat on them the wrong way. But the place had a charm that drew people in: the laughter, the smell of food, the comfort of a hot drink on a cold morning. It was a second home for many. Emily often thought of the cafe as her stage. Every customer was part of her audience, and she played her role of the friendly waitress with dedication. Sometimes she even forgot her troubles when she lost herself in the rhythm of work. There was a strange peace in pouring coffee, wiping tables, and exchanging quick smiles with strangers. That morning seemed like it would pass like all the others. She noticed the same familiar faces: the elderly man with the newspaper, the group of college students giggling over muffins, the tired woman tapping at her laptop. It was routine, it was normal, and Emily was glad for that, because in her life, normalcy meant stability, and stability meant safety. Little did she know that within the next hour, her world was about to change forever, and it would all begin with one man who would walk through the door, sit down quietly, and unknowingly carry a piece of her past that she had never even been told about. But before that moment came, Emily was still lost in the ordinary rhythm of her day. She wiped down a table near the window and glanced outside at the busy street. Cars rushed past, people hurried to work. Life outside moved as fast as it always did. Yet inside the cafe, time felt slower. She sighed softly, thinking about her mother back at home, probably humming as she cooked breakfast. Margaret was everything to her, a woman who had sacrificed her own happiness to raise her daughter. And Emily often wondered if she would ever be able to give her mother the kind of life she deserved. These thoughts filled her heart as she picked up another tray and prepared to greet the next customer. She had no idea that fate had quietly chosen this ordinary day to plant a seed of extraordinary change. She had no idea that the ring on a stranger's hand would stir memories long buried, or that her simple words would unlock truths her mother had kept hidden for decades. All she knew in that moment was the warmth of the coffee cup in her hand, the chatter of the cafe around her, and the feeling that life, as ordinary as it seemed, was quietly waiting to surprise her in ways she could never imagine. The bell above the cafe door jingled once again, and Emily turned her head automatically, carrying a tray filled with steaming mugs of coffee. She was used to people coming in and out, but this time something felt different. A tall man stepped inside, dressed in a simple but very expensive-looking suit. His shoes polished to a shine, his watch discreet but clearly valuable. He carried himself with quiet confidence, not the loud arrogance that rich customers sometimes had. His eyes scanned the cafe briefly before he walked to a corner table near the window and sat down. Though he was alone, it felt as if the room shifted around him. People noticed him without realizing why. Emily had no idea at first who he was. To her, he was just another customer, another order, another smile to give. But her coworker Sarah nudged her elbow and whispered with wide eyes, "Do you know who that is?" "That's Jonathan Harris." Emily blinked, confused. She had heard the name before. A billionaire businessman who owned massive real estate companies. His picture sometimes appeared in newspapers when he donated to charities, or when he attended fancy events with politicians and celebrities. But she had never expected someone like him to walk into this small cafe. She laughed it off nervously. What would a billionaire be doing here of all places? Sarah shrugged. Who knows? Maybe he just wants coffee like the rest of us. And returned to her work. But Emily's curiosity had been sparked. Jonathan sat quietly, his posture calm, his expression unreadable, unlike most wealthy people Emily had served before. He did not look around with judgment. He did not act superior, in fact. He blended in almost too well, if not for his tailored suit and the aura of quiet authority. One might mistake him for an ordinary man. Emily hesitated for a moment, but then carried her notepad and approached his table. Her voice steady but warm as she said, "Good morning, sir. What would you like today?" Jonathan looked up, and for a second Emily was caught by the sharpness of his gaze. His eyes were kind but held a depth that made her feel as though he saw more than what appeared on the surface. He gave her a polite smile, the kind that was rare among wealthy customers, and said simply, "Just a black coffee, please." Emily nodded and wrote it down, a little surprised. She had expected a complicated order, something unusual or grand. But this billionaire wanted the simplest drink on the menu. When she brought the cup to him a few minutes later, he thanked her quietly, his voice low but sincere. She left the table but couldn't help glancing at him from time to time. He sipped his coffee, slowly, staring out of the window as if lost in thought. He looked nothing like the headlines described him. There was no arrogance, no rush, no crowd of assistants around him, just a man sitting alone with his coffee. Around the cafe, the regular customers had started whispering. Some recognized him, others only guessed. A few young men even pulled out their phones, trying to take photos without being too obvious. Emily shook her head. People could be shameless sometimes. But Jonathan seemed unaffected, as though he was used to attention, or perhaps he had learned to ignore it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about him being here. Something that wasn't random. It was as though fate had brought him into this modest cafe on this very day. As Emily continued serving other tables, she thought about him. She knew billionaires were just people like anyone else, but still, it was strange to see someone of his status sitting in a place where she worked. She wondered about his life. Did he wake up in a mansion every morning? Did he ever worry about paying bills or wondering what to cook for dinner? Did he have a family waiting for him at home, or was he lonely despite his wealth? The thought made her strangely sad. She had grown up, believing that money solved everything. But watching Jonathan Harris sitting silently with nothing but a cup of coffee in his hands, she realized perhaps life was complicated even at the top. Emily tried to push away her curiosity, but her eyes kept drifting to his hand. He rested it on the table, long fingers curled around the coffee cup. And that was when she noticed the ring, a unique piece of jewelry that shone under the soft light of the cafe. It wasn't flashy like a diamond. It wasn't something meant to show off. Instead, it was old-fashioned, elegant, with an engraved stone set into it, the kind of ring that carried history. It seemed out of place on someone like him. Yet it suited him perfectly. The sight of it stirred something in her memory, though she could not place it yet. For Jonathan, this moment in the cafe was quiet but heavy. He had chosen this place on purpose, far from his usual high-end restaurants or private offices. He wanted a taste of ordinary life, a reminder of the world beyond meetings, contracts, and boardrooms, as he sipped his coffee. He thought about the years that had passed, about choices that had shaped his life. He had wealth, success, and power, yet there was an emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. He carried secrets in his heart, secrets he thought he would take to his grave. But life had a way of surprising even the strongest men, and soon those secrets would surface in the most unexpected way. Emily didn't know it yet, but this man's presence would connect with her life in ways she could never have dreamed of. She didn't know that the ordinary act of serving coffee to a quiet billionaire would open the door to truths hidden for decades, to answers she had silently longed for, and to a bond that fate had carefully kept aside until this very day. For now, she only saw him as a polite, mysterious customer, sitting quietly in the corner with his simple black coffee, unaware that both their lives were about to change forever. Emily carried another tray to a table near the door, placing down 2 cappuccinos and a slice of cheesecake for a pair of college girls who were too busy giggling to notice her. She smiled politely and moved on, but her eyes, almost without her permission, slid back to the corner where Jonathan Harris sat alone. The man looked so calm, sipping his black coffee, his hand resting casually on the table. And it was that hand, more than his famous face or expensive suit, that suddenly caught Emily's attention. The ring on his finger glimmered faintly under the cafe's soft yellow lights, and in that instant, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just any ring. The design was strange, old-fashioned, something you didn't see in modern jewelry stores. A round stone with tiny engravings that twisted around it like vines. Emily froze for a moment, because she had seen that ring before. Not on him, but on her own mother's hand. Her mother's ring had the same engraved design, the same color of stone. She had grown up staring at it whenever her mother's hand brushed her hair back or held her close. She remembered asking her mother once, "Where did you get this ring?" And Margaret had only smiled softly and said, "It was given to me a long time ago, by someone I loved very much." Emily had never asked again, out of respect for the sadness in her mother's voice. Now, seeing the same design on this billionaire's hand, her mind swirled. What were the odds? Was it possible that it was just a coincidence? 2 rings crafted by different jewelers with the same pattern. But her gut told her otherwise. This was not a coincidence. This ring and her mother's ring were connected somehow. She felt a strange pull inside her. Curiosity stronger than caution, her heart beating louder than the chatter of the cafe. She tried to shake the thought away, telling herself not to overthink, but the more she tried, the stronger the urge grew, until the words escaped her lips before she could stop them. As she returned to Jonathan's table to check if he needed anything else, she placed her tray against her hip and blurted out, almost nervously, "Sir, my mother has a ring just like yours." Her voice trembled slightly, not because she was afraid of him, but because she didn't know how he might react. Her co-workers nearby glanced in her direction, surprised at her boldness. Jonathan, who had been staring at the window lost in thought, turned his head slowly and looked directly at her. His calm expression flickered into something else. His eyes widened, and for a second, it seemed as if all the air in the cafe had vanished. Emily's heart thudded painfully. Had she offended him? Had she crossed a line? She quickly added, "I just noticed, it looks very similar. My mother has worn hers for as long as I can remember." Jonathan put down his cup gently, his hand shaking ever so slightly. His gaze dropped to the ring on his finger as though seeing it for the first time, then back up to Emily's face. His voice was low, quiet, and filled with a weight she couldn't understand as he asked, "Your mother, what does her ring look like exactly?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to recall the details. Though she knew them by heart, she explained, "It has the same stone, the same vine-like design around it. It's not shiny like new jewelry. It looks old, like it has a story." Jonathan's hand tightened around his cup, his jaw clenched, and his eyes softened with something between shock and pain. The cafe around them carried on as usual, laughter, the hum of conversation, the hiss of the coffee machine. Yet for Emily and Jonathan, the world seemed to narrow down to just that table, just that ring, and just that revelation. Emily felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. Why had she said it? Why did she feel like she had stirred something hidden? But she also felt a strange sense of rightness, as if she was meant to notice it, meant to speak it aloud. Jonathan, meanwhile, stared at her. With a searching intensity, his lips parted as though he wanted to say more. But he didn't. Not yet. He only whispered, almost to himself, "It can't be. After all these years." Emily tilted her head, her curiosity only deepening. But before she could ask what he meant, Sarah called her name from behind the counter, breaking the spell. Emily excused herself quickly, her hands trembling as she placed her tray back by the register. She told herself to forget about it, to focus on work. But her mind wouldn't let her. The image of that ring, the way Jonathan's expression had changed, the way his voice cracked when he spoke. It all played over and over in her head like a record that refused to stop. She didn't know it yet, but the simple comment she had made would set into motion a chain of events that would unravel the secrets of her past and connect her to this billionaire in ways she never thought possible. Jonathan sat back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't thought about the other ring in years, the twin to the one he still wore. He had given it away decades ago, to a woman he had loved but lost, a woman he never found again, and now this waitress, this young girl with kind eyes, was telling him that her mother had the same ring. Could it be? Was it possible? A flood of memories rushed back to him, and for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Harris, the man who had everything money could buy, felt unsteady, unsure, and on the edge of a truth he had long buried. Emily continued her shift in a daze, her hands moving out of habit, serving, smiling, clearing tables, but her mind trapped in that single moment. She wondered if she had imagined the tension, the shock in his eyes, but deep inside, she knew she hadn't. Something about that ring connected her life to his, and though she couldn't explain how or why, she felt the beginning of a story much larger than herself unfolding right in front of her eyes. Jonathan placed his cup carefully on the saucer. But his hand trembled slightly, a tiny movement that most people would not have noticed, but Emily saw it, because she was standing right there, her heart beat faster. She could sense that her words had touched something deep inside him. For a moment, the confident billionaire looked almost fragile. His eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. She wondered if she had done something wrong by mentioning the ring. Perhaps it was a personal matter. Perhaps she had opened a wound without realizing it. He leaned forward just a little, his voice softer now, lower, carrying weight. "Tell me about your mother's ring," he said, as if every syllable cost him effort. Emily hesitated, but there was nothing to hide, so she explained. "It looks exactly like yours, the same design, the same stone. I've always thought it was beautiful. She's had it for as long as I can remember. She never takes it off. She told me once it was a gift from someone important in her past." As she spoke, she noticed how his eyes flickered, like a storm was rising behind them. His jaw tightened, and then he looked down at his own hand, twisting the ring slowly around his finger, as though reminding himself that it was real. The cafe buzzed on around them, but for Jonathan, the noise faded into the background. In his mind, he was no longer sitting in a small cafe. He was years back in time, seeing a younger version of himself standing with the woman he had loved more than anything. He remembered the night he had given her the twin ring, promising her a future together. A promise he could not keep. Life, responsibilities, and cruel circumstances had torn them apart. He had searched for her once, but she had vanished from his world, leaving him only with memories and regret. He had believed he would never know what became of her, and now here stood this young waitress, speaking about a mother who owned the other half of his broken promise. Emily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Sensing his silence, she tried to smile, to ease the tension. "It's funny, right? What a coincidence," she said lightly. Though inside she didn't feel it was funny at all, Jonathan lifted his gaze to her face. His eyes were no longer calm. They carried questions, suspicion, and something else, something like hope. "Your mother?" he said slowly. "What's her name?" Emily felt her throat tighten. The question felt oddly heavy, but she answered honestly, "Margaret." The name seemed to strike him like a bolt of lightning. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His chest rose and fell quickly. He whispered the name again to himself, as though testing it, tasting it, remembering it. "Yes, Margaret." he said finally, his voice breaking. I once knew a Margaret. His eyes glistened faintly, and Emily felt a strange shiver run down her spine. Her curiosity now burned like fire, but before she could ask more, Jonathan forced himself to straighten up. He took a deep breath, placed his hand flat on the table to steady himself, and gave her a small, practiced smile, the kind people put on when they don't want to reveal too much. It is a rare design, he said calmly, though his voice still trembled. Not something one sees often. Emily nodded, though she didn't believe for a second that this was only about a rare design. His reaction had been too raw, too real. Jonathan tried to drink his coffee again, but it had gone cold. He barely tasted it anyway. His mind was racing. If this girl's mother was the same Margaret, then this was no accident. This was fate bringing the past back into his life. But was it possible? Could Margaret have kept something from him? Something as important as this young woman standing in front of him. He studied Emily's face more closely now, her features, the shape of her eyes, the way her smile tugged at her lips when she was nervous. Something inside him stirred, something familiar, like looking into a mirror of the past. But he held himself back. He needed answers before he could let his heart accept what his instincts were screaming. Emily excused herself, sensing that he needed space, but her mind whirled. Why had he reacted that way? Why had his voice trembled when she mentioned her mother? Why did it feel as if something important had just cracked open in the air between them? She carried another tray to a different table, but her eyes kept drifting back to him, to the man sitting alone, staring down at the ring on his hand as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. She felt uneasy, not in a dangerous way, but in a way that told her her life was about to change, though she didn't yet know how. Jonathan sat for a long time after that, long after his coffee had turned bitter and undrinkable. He couldn't bring himself to leave just yet. Part of him wanted to stand up, demand answers, ask this girl every question that had been buried in his heart for decades. But another part of him was afraid of the truth, afraid of what he might discover. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt a spark of hope, a fragile flame that he hadn't dared to light for so long. When Emily returned one last time to clear his table, he looked at her again. His eyes softer now but still searching. He wanted to speak, to tell her what he was thinking. But the words refused to form. Instead he only thanked her politely, placed a generous tip on the table and stood to leave. But before he stepped out of the cafe, he glanced back once more, his gaze lingering on her as though memorizing her face. Then he walked out into the street, leaving Emily standing there with the tray in her hands, her heart pounding with questions, her mind full of possibilities, and her world quietly shifting, though she didn't yet understand in what direction. Neither of them could know in that moment that this chance meeting, this single mention of a ring, would open the door to secrets that had been locked away for years. Jonathan carried the weight of the past in his chest, and Emily carried the innocence of someone about to stumble upon the truth. Fate had placed them both at the same table, and the story was only just beginning. Emily could not sleep that night. The memory of the billionaire sitting in the cafe stayed with her like a shadow that would not fade. She tossed and turned on her small bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment when she had pointed out the ring, replaying the look on his face, the shock, the pain, the disbelief. It had not been the look of a stranger hearing a random comment. It had been the look of a man remembering something long buried, something that mattered deeply. Her heart told her there was more to it, more than coincidence, more than just two old rings that happened to look alike. In the quiet of her room, she thought about her mother's ring. She had seen it all her life. She remembered how as a little girl she would slip it onto her tiny finger and admire how it shone in the sunlight. Her mother always laughed softly and told her it was too precious to play with. "This ring is a piece of my past," Margaret would say. "A past that I carry with me, even if the rest of it is gone." Emily never understood what she meant, but she had always sensed there was a sadness behind those words. Now, after meeting Jonathan Harris, she felt that sadness more sharply. The next morning, she could not keep it inside any longer. When she returned home from her shift, she found her mother sitting at the small kitchen table, folding laundry, the ring glinting on her finger as always. Emily sat across from her, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom," she began carefully, "something strange happened at work yesterday." Margaret looked up, curious. What do you mean, darling? Emily hesitated for a moment before blurting it out. A man came into the cafe, and he was wearing a ring exactly like yours. I told him about yours, and he reacted in a strange way. His name was Jonathan Harris. The moment the name left her lips, Margaret froze. The piece of fabric she had been folding slipped from her hands and fell onto the table. Her face went pale, her eyes widened, and her lips parted as if she had just seen a ghost. Emily leaned forward, concern flooding her voice. Mom? Do you know him? Margaret's hands shook as she reached for a glass of water, taking a slow sip before answering. Her voice quiet, trembling. Jonathan Harris. I never thought I would hear that name again. Emily's heart thudded loudly. So you do know him? Margaret closed her eyes, as if fighting memories she had locked away for years. Finally she whispered, he was once the love of my life. Emily sat in stunned silence. The words hit her like a thunderclap. Her mother had never spoken about anyone from her past. Never mentioned a man she had loved, and certainly never mentioned a man like Jonathan Harris. You loved him? Emily asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret nodded slowly, tears beginning to well in her eyes. Yes, many years ago, before you were born, Jonathan and I were young, full of dreams. We thought nothing could separate us. He gave me this ring as a promise, a symbol of a future we planned together. He had another ring made for himself, a pair that bound us. But life is not always kind. Circumstances pulled us apart, and we lost each other. Emily listened, her heart racing. But why didn't you ever tell me? She asked, her voice cracking. Why did you never mention him? Margaret wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, her face lined with pain. Because it hurt too much, Emily, because when he was gone, I thought I would never see him again, and I believed he had moved on, that his world was far too different from mine. I did not want to carry the wound forever, so I chose silence. I focused on you, on raising you the best I could. You were my entire world. I didn't want the ghost of the past to haunt our lives. Emily sat back, the truth spinning in her mind. The memory of Jonathan's shocked expression when she mentioned the ring now made perfect sense. He had recognized the connection instantly. He had remembered Margaret. He had remembered the love they once shared. Mom, Emily whispered, her throat tight. Does that mean he could be my father? The words slipped out before she could stop them. Margaret gasped softly, her hands trembling harder now. She pressed them to her face, unable to answer at first. Finally, she lowered them and looked into Emily's eyes. I never wanted you to carry that burden. I never wanted you to grow up with unanswered questions. But yes, Jonathan Harris is your father. Emily felt her world tilt. Everything inside her spun as if she were on a ship in stormy waters. The billionaire she had served coffee to yesterday, the man she had only read about in newspapers, was her father. All her life she had wondered about him. But she never expected the truth to be this. She thought of the ring again. The pair of rings that had held the secret all along. One on her mother's hand, one on her father's, a silent story waiting to be revealed. Margaret reached across the table and took Emily's hand, her voice breaking. I was young and scared, Emily. I didn't know how to tell you. I thought it was better this way. I thought protecting you from his world was the right thing. Please understand, everything I did was for you. Tears slid down Emily's cheeks. She squeezed her mother's hand tightly, torn between shock and compassion. I understand, Mom, but this changes everything. He's alive, he's here, and he knows now. Margaret looked down at her ring, twisting it gently. I never expected fate to bring him back into our lives, but perhaps it was meant to happen. Perhaps the truth cannot stay buried forever. Emily nodded slowly. Though her heart was still racing, deep inside she felt a strange mixture of fear and hope. Fear of what the truth would bring, but hope that maybe, just maybe, she was about to discover the father she had never known. That night, as Emily lay in bed, her mind swirled with images of Jonathan, of the way he looked at her, of the way his voice broke when he heard her mother's name. She realized that the world she had always known, simple, ordinary, filled with quiet struggles, was no longer the same. A door had opened, and on the other side was a man who carried half her history, a man she had unknowingly met in the cafe, a man who was her father. What began as a casual comment about a ring had now unraveled a Truth powerful enough to change the rest of her life. Jonathan could not get the young waitress out of his mind, even after he left the cafe. The way she had spoken about her mother's ring, the name she had given him, Margaret, it all came back to him with a force that almost knocked the air out of his lungs. He spent that night pacing in his study, staring at the ring on his finger, whispering her name to himself again and again, Margaret, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. And now there was Emily, her daughter, their daughter. He could feel it in his bones, though he had no proof yet. His heart told him that fate had just brought him face to face with the child he never knew he had. The next day, Jonathan made a decision. He could not live with questions and half-formed guesses. He needed to see Margaret. He needed to look her in the eye and hear the truth. He asked one of his trusted assistants to quietly gather information. It didn't take long. The world might be big, but money and influence made it small. By evening he knew where Margaret lived, a modest apartment in an older building, nothing fancy, nothing like the glittering world he inhabited. For a moment, guilt washed over him. He had lived in luxury while she had lived in struggle, and perhaps all along, their lives had been connected by the thread of this secret. When Jonathan knocked on Margaret's door the next evening, his heart was pounding harder than it ever had during any business deal. He had faced boardrooms full of investors, journalists with sharp questions, even politicians, but none of it compared to the trembling in his chest as he waited. The door opened slowly, and there she was, Margaret, older now, with lines of time and hardship etched into her face, but still the woman he remembered. Her eyes widened the moment she saw him, her hand flying to her mouth, the ring on her finger catching the light. She whispered his name like a prayer, Jonathan. For a moment neither of them moved. Silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. Finally Jonathan found his voice, though it cracked. It's really you? Margaret blinked back tears, stepping aside. Come in, she said, her voice trembling. He entered the small apartment, noticing the worn furniture, the scent of home-cooked food lingering in the air, the warmth of a simple life so different from the one he had lived. They sat at the small kitchen table, the same table, where Margaret had once told Emily the truth, and for a while, they simply stared at each other, both overwhelmed. Jonathan was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you tell me, Margaret? Why didn't you let me know? Margaret lowered her gaze, twisting the ring on her finger. Because I thought you had moved on, Jonathan. Your world was not mine. You were rising so high, and I was afraid I would only hold you back. When I found out I was expecting, I decided to raise her alone. I thought it was the only way. Jonathan's breath caught. The words hit him like a blow. He had missed everything. The first steps, the first words, birthdays, school days, all of it, gone in the blink of an eye. Tears pricked at his eyes. Her name is Emily, he said softly. She told me yesterday, when she mentioned your ring. I looked at her, Margaret, and I saw myself. I knew. Margaret wiped her eyes, her voice breaking. I never wanted to keep her from you, Jonathan, but I wanted to protect her. I didn't want her to grow up with expectations or disappointments. I thought it was safer if she never knew. Jonathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers, his voice firm but tender. You should have trusted me. She is my daughter too, and I want to be part of her life, even if it's late, even if I've missed so much. I want to know her. I want her to know me. At that moment, Emily walked in. She had been out buying groceries, her arms full of bags. She stopped in the doorway when she saw them, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. The scene in front of her looked almost unreal. Her mother sitting with the billionaire from the cafe, both of them with tears in their eyes, both of them holding hands across the table. The bags slipped from her fingers onto the floor, and the sound made them both turn. Jonathan rose slowly, his chest tightening, as if every step toward her carried the weight of 20 years. Emily, he said softly, her name shaking in his voice. I believe I am your father. Emily froze, her heart hammering. The words were ones she had half expected after her mother's confession. Yet hearing them spoken aloud from his lips was overwhelming. She wanted to speak, to ask 1,000 questions, but her throat felt tight. Her mother rushed to her side, whispering, It's true, Emily, it's all true. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She looked from her mother to Jonathan, and in that moment, she saw it, the resemblance, the same shape of eyes, the same curve of the jaw, the same weight of emotions. She whispered back, her voice breaking. All this time, I never knew. Jonathan stepped closer, but he did not rush. He gave her space, his voice gentle. I didn't know either, Emily. If I had, I would never have stayed away. I have missed so much, but if you let me, I want to make up for it. I want to be in your life. Emily's tears spilled down her cheeks, her heart torn between anger and longing. She had dreamed of knowing her father all her life, but she had never expected him to appear like this. Never expected him to be one of the richest men in the country. Yet in that moment, none of the money or fame mattered. What mattered was the raw truth, the fragile bridge forming between them. The evening stretched on with tears, with memories, with explanations. Jonathan shared stories of his youth. Margaret filled in the missing years, and Emily listened. Her emotions a storm. Sometimes she smiled, sometimes she cried, but through it all, she felt something she had never felt before. A strange sense of wholeness. A sense that the missing piece of her life had suddenly fallen into place. The past had been painful, but the future, for the first time, seemed full of possibility. Though the road ahead would not be easy, the three of them had taken the first step toward healing, toward understanding, and toward building something new. That night, as Jonathan left the apartment, he turned back at the door, his eyes on Emily. I will not disappear again, he promised, his voice firm. You have my word. And Emily, still trembling, nodded slowly, her heart still uncertain but her soul quietly daring to hope. The secret was no longer hidden, the truth was out, and with it, the chance for a new beginning. The news did not stay quiet for long. Word spread faster than Emily or her mother could have imagined. At first it was just the neighbors whispering in the stairwell, curious about the expensive car they had seen parked outside their building. Then it was co-workers at the cafe, nudging Emily and teasing her about the powerful man who had visited, and soon after, it became something bigger. Stories appeared in local papers. Blurry photos of Jonathan sitting in the cafe circulated online, and people speculated wildly. Some claimed the billionaire had a secret family. Others insisted it was just gossip. But the whispers turned into waves, and before long the whole town seemed to know. For Emily, it was overwhelming. One day she was a simple waitress, invisible to most people, and the next day she was being stared at, pointed at, even followed by curious strangers. Her phone buzzed with calls from journalists. Her cafe manager looked nervous about the attention, and her quiet life seemed to vanish overnight. She struggled to keep up with the rush of emotions. Part of her wanted to run away, to hide, but another part of her could not ignore the truth. Jonathan was her father, and nothing could erase that now. At home, her mother worried constantly. Margaret feared that this revelation would swallow them whole. She had lived her life in modest peace, and now she was suddenly tied to one of the richest men in the country. She paced the kitchen late at night, wringing her hands, whispering, I didn't want this for you, Emily. I didn't want your life to become a circus. Emily tried to comfort her, but her own heart was heavy. She had questions that no one could answer. What did it mean to suddenly be the daughter of a billionaire? Did she belong in his world, or would she always be an outsider peeking in? Jonathan, on the other hand, faced his own storm. His advisors begged him to stay quiet, to avoid scandal, to issue a statement denying the rumors, but he refused. He was not ashamed. He had lost enough years. He would not lose more by hiding. He stood before cameras one evening and admitted that yes, he had discovered he had a daughter. Yes, he was ready to accept her into his life. The nation buzzed with shock. Some admired his honesty. Others criticized him for the years of absence. But Jonathan did not care. For the first time, he was not speaking as a businessman, he was speaking as a father. Emily watched that interview on television, her chest tightening as he spoke her name with pride. She wanted to feel joy, but all she felt was confusion. Her life was changing too fast. Her co-workers treated her differently, some with jealousy, some with awe. Her friends avoided her, unsure how to act around her now. She even caught customers in the cafe staring at her as if she were no longer the cheerful waitress but some kind of celebrity. It made her skin crawl. She wanted to shout at them that she was the same Emily. Nothing had changed inside her. But she knew they would never see her the same way again. At the same time, she wrestled with her feelings toward Jonathan. She wanted to trust him, to believe he truly cared, but doubts gnawed at her. What if he was only reaching out because of guilt? What if his promises faded with time? What if his powerful world swallowed her up and left her mother behind? She lay awake at night thinking about it, torn between anger for the lost years and longing for the father she had always dreamed of. Sometimes she wanted to push him away, but then she remembered the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way his voice cracked when he said her name, and her heart softened too. Jonathan tried to bridge the gap. He invited Emily and Margaret to dinner at his estate, a place so grand it felt like something from another world. Chandeliers glittered above them. Servants moved quietly in the background, and Emily felt small, out of place. She clutched her mother's hand tightly, afraid of being swallowed by the luxury. But Jonathan stayed close, guiding them, reassuring them, telling them that this was not about wealth. This was about family. Still, Emily felt the eyes of others on her, relatives she had never met, business associates who whispered. Some welcomed her warmly, but others looked at her as if she were an intruder. The pressure grew heavier with each passing day. Magazines printed her photo, calling her the billionaire's secret daughter. Strangers sent letters, some begging for help, others spitting out cruel words. Margaret begged her to ignore it, to focus on her heart, not the noise of the world. But Emily could not help feeling crushed. Her simple life had been replaced by a storm of attention she had never wanted. Sometimes she wished she had never noticed the ring, never spoken those words in the cafe, but deep down she knew the truth had been waiting, and it would have found her one way or another. Despite the chaos, a bond slowly began to grow. Jonathan showed up often, not with gifts of money or luxury, but with time. He sat in their small apartment, eating her mother's simple meals, listening to Emily's stories about the cafe, asking her about her dreams. For the first time, she felt what it was like to have a father listening, caring, guiding. It was strange, new, but comforting. He did not treat her like a burden or a responsibility. He treated her like family. Slowly, the walls of doubt in her heart began to crack. The world outside continued to buzz with shock and gossip, but inside their small home, something fragile and beautiful was forming. A connection that money could not buy. Jonathan promised to protect them, to make sure they were safe from the madness, and though Margaret worried, she too felt a weight lifting. The past was no longer a secret, the burden no longer hers alone. They faced it together now, the three of them. Emily stood by the window one evening, watching the city lights flicker, thinking about how much her life had changed in such a short time. She felt fear, yes, but also strength. The truth had shaken her, but it had also given her something she had longed for all her life. A father, imperfect and late, but real. And as she thought of that, a small smile curved her lips. Perhaps the shock of the world was only the beginning. Perhaps what mattered most was how they chose to walk forward, together, into a future none of them had expected. The storm of attention slowly began to fade. People found new stories to gossip about, and though Emily was still whispered about now and then, her life started to settle into a strange but steady rhythm. She still worked at the cafe part-time, despite her coworkers telling her she didn't need to anymore. She could have walked away, lived in comfort, accepted every luxury Jonathan offered, but she refused. The cafe was part of her. It was the place where she had laughed, struggled, and built herself into who she was, and more importantly, it was the place where everything had begun. The place where a single comment about a ring had changed her life forever. Jonathan respected her decision. He never forced his wealth on her. Instead, he offered support in ways that mattered. One evening, as they sat together in her small living room, he asked her gently, "What do you dream of, Emily? What do you want for yourself?" She hesitated, afraid to sound foolish, but finally she whispered, "I always wanted to study business, to one day open a bakery of my own, a place where people could feel at home, like they do in the cafe." Jonathan smiled softly, his eyes shining with pride. "Then that is what you will do. I will help you, not because you are my daughter, but because I believe in you." With his guidance, Emily enrolled in night classes, balancing her studies with her cafe shifts. It was not easy, but she felt stronger with every step. She was no longer working only to survive. She was working toward something. A dream that had once seemed impossible now felt within reach. Her mother watched with tears in her eyes, proud and relieved. Margaret had carried so many burdens alone, and now, seeing Jonathan beside Emily, She felt less afraid of the future. The relationship between Jonathan and Margaret also changed. It did not return to the love of their youth. Too much time had passed, too many scars remained. But there was a gentleness between them, an understanding. They had shared a bond once, and now they shared a daughter. That was enough to bring them together again in a different way. Sometimes they sat together in silence, remembering the past. Sometimes they laughed softly about the strange twists of fate. Neither of them expected to rebuild what was lost. But they found peace in knowing that their story had not ended in silence, but in reunion. For Emily, the hardest part was learning to balance two worlds. On one side was her simple life, the cafe, the small apartment, her friends, the routines that kept her grounded. On the other side was Jonathan's world of wealth, influence, and endless possibilities. At first she felt torn between them, afraid she would lose herself if she leaned too far into his side. But Jonathan never pushed. He reminded her again and again that she did not have to change to fit into his world. Instead, he told her his world would change to include her, and slowly she began to believe him. People around her continued to react in different ways. Some treated her with awe, others with jealousy. But Emily learned to ignore the noise. She understood now that her worth was not in Jonathan's name or his fortune. Her worth was in who she was, a hard-working daughter, a kind waitress, a young woman chasing her dreams. The ring had revealed a truth, but it had not changed the core of who she was. If anything, it made her stronger, more determined to prove that she could stand on her own, while still embracing the family she had discovered. Jonathan kept his promise. He was present, not with grand gestures but with time. He showed up to her classes sometimes, quietly sitting at the back to watch her presentations. He visited the cafe and ordered his simple black coffee, smiling proudly as she worked. He asked about her life, listened to her stories, laughed at her jokes. For Emily, those moments mattered more than all the riches he could ever give. They were the moments of a father finally being there, filling a void she had carried for so long. Margaret, too, began to heal. The secret she had carried for decades was no longer hers alone. The weight of silence lifted from her shoulders. She could see Jonathan and Emily together without fear. She could see her daughter's happiness growing, and she felt a quiet relief. She had made mistakes, yes, but life had given her a second chance to set things right. Sometimes she would look at the two of them and smile, whispering to herself, "It was meant to be." One afternoon, as Emily closed up the cafe after a long shift, Jonathan joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the counter. They sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker to life. The cafe was empty, quiet and warm. Jonathan looked at her and said softly, "Do you realize, Emily, that everything changed the moment you noticed this ring?" He twisted it gently on his finger. She laughed softly. "Yes, one simple question, and now nothing is the same." He nodded. Sometimes life hides its greatest surprises in the smallest moments. They shared a quiet smile, both of them knowing how true that was. In the weeks that followed, Emily's confidence grew. She began planning her bakery with Jonathan's support, sketching designs, writing ideas in notebooks, dreaming not just for herself but for her mother too. She wanted a place where her mother could finally rest from years of sacrifice. A place where their family could start fresh. It would take time. But for the first time in her life, time did not feel like an enemy. It felt like a gift. Life was not suddenly perfect. There were still challenges. There were still doubts. But now there was also hope. There was family. There was truth. Emily had started her journey as a simple waitress serving coffee to strangers. But fate had handed her a story far bigger than she could have imagined. A story of love lost and found, of secrets revealed, of a family broken and then mended. As she walked home one evening, her mother by her side, and Jonathan a few steps behind them, Emily looked up at the sky, the stars glowing faintly above, and she felt something she had never felt so deeply before. She felt whole. The past had been painful. The discovery had been shocking. But the ending was not about wealth or fame. It was about love, about belonging, about finding the missing piece of herself, and she knew in her heart that no matter what came next, they would face it together, because sometimes the smallest words, spoken on the most ordinary day, could change a life forever.